You are watching the DocTalk Show.
Welcome back to the DocTalk Show. So we've seen how people who basically are persistently sad can be diagnosed as people in depression. And we have been told what they look like, but would like to understand, Juliet, what places people at risk? How should I know? Would I take more care for myself to ensure that I don't get depressed? So how do I know that I'm in a group that is at a high risk of getting depressed?
The commonest risk is genetic. There are people who are genetically made in such a way that certain things in their environment will trigger them to get depressed. So they are genetically,
You're born that way. You're wired that way.
I didn't want to use the word wired, but now that you bring it up, yes, they're wired that way, that they are more prone. It doesn't mean that they will develop depression necessarily, but they are prone. So when the environment is right, it will trigger them into developing depression. That's the commonest. However, there are other things that may put us at risk of developing depression. For instance, chronic physical illness. When people get chronically physically ill, with conditions such as the commonest ones we have in this country, HIV, cancer, and others.
So these long-term illnesses, the ones that take a long time.
Non-communicable diseases.
Non-communicable diseases that are chronic. They tend to predispose people to developing depressive episodes. Stress is something we talk about all the time in our community. It is one of the commonest causes in our environment of people developing depression. And stress can be from any reasons. It could be economic, it could be work-related, it could be
related.
All those things. I would like to broadly call it relationships, not only with a spouse, but other relationships as well.
Like mothers-in-law, for example, fathers-in-law, sisters-in-law.
It can even be sisters.
Yes, your own family.
Or mothers, yeah. Not necessarily mothers-in-law or sisters-in-law. Yeah. So relationships in general can cause stress. And those kinds of things that are stressful can lead, especially if they're persistent, can lead to depression.
Psychological trauma for people who have faced significant emotional, physical, traumatic situations. They are also at a higher risk of depression, whether it is at a community level or even at individual level.
When you say psychological trauma,
yes.
When we talk of what does this mean? Give us examples of these psychological trauma.
In this case, like if they've faced some form of disaster, whether it is war, whether it is landslides or other environmental disasters, or coming back to the individual, if they have had any form of emotional, sexual, or physical abuse, neglect, and starting right from childhood through their course of life, it can cause a vulnerability to developing depression. And in that case, this form of adversity or of abuse has caused them what would categorize as psychological trauma, as opposed to physical trauma, like an accident, like we had talked about. Though, like an accident can cause both physical and psychological trauma. And then something else that I would want to mention is something that really we are struggling with as individuals, as families, as communities. That is the issue of alcohol and substance use. By the very nature of how these, what we call psychoactive substances, affect our brains, they make someone more vulnerable to developing mental health problems. And common amongst this also is depression.
But it so looks like people who are on drugs or taking alcohol tend to behave in a manner that is more violent and aggressive, and like the depression. And so how do we reconcile that? Because I assumed that people who use drugs are taking them to get euphoric and feel...
Yes. I think hopefully one time we'll get another opportunity to talk about the different effects of alcohol and substances. They cause a range of behavioral and other mental health problems. But in the case, like I said, someone who is depressed will take some of these substances or alcohol just to feel better, to kind of get energized or have their mood lifted, though that becomes temporary, and then other effects of these chemicals will come through. So they'll be depressed, but they might also develop other mental health and physical problems.
Okay.
And then also vice versa, like we said. Once.
Juliet, we've heard that some pregnant women, after giving birth, or get depressed. How does this come about? Is it something that is common? Because we know that I've seen patients, women get children after giving birth. Then the society says, she the first to give birth, was that labor that bad that she now is in depression? How does this come about?
Many times what is underlying is that there are chemical changes in this individual, the woman who has just given birth, that determine that they get depressed, even when everything around them may be normal. So that the way that the hormones change, I think we shall not go into the details of this, changes certain chemicals in the brain that causes the woman to, in fact, get depressed. Anything between 10 and 20% of women who have just had a baby may be depressed within the first 4 weeks of delivery. So it is a big risk factor, particularly for women.
Thank you very much, and that is quite worrisome, because we are having daily births and women giving birth. So this brings me to my next question. How are we, people who are in the society, in the communities, or living with pregnant women and living a normal life, how are we supposed to tell that? How am I supposed to tell that I'm getting depressed?
You struggle to communicate with others, and many times you also easily become annoyed. You're irritable. You know, you notice that especially to those close to you lash out. Then you might want to think that this is depression, and then it's like a continuous struggle, and you feel like you're sinking further. You start even losing, like I said, hope in life, feeling like maybe you're not worth anything in life, you can't contribute anything. And then these ideas of self-doubt, of feeling guilty about the smallest thing, of saying, but maybe, instead of suffering like this, why shouldn't I maybe just leave this world? And then these ideas say, but you know what? I can even, make it faster. I can take my life. And then you start struggling with that. And so that is, from a personal point of view, if you go through these emotions, you can ask yourself that maybe this is depression, because many times people might not know that this is depression, and it is an illness. It's not just a phase. It's not just stress, normal stress, because when you're in good mental health, you can deal with the normal stresses. Some phase comes, you deal with the normal stress.
So Juliet, back to these women who are bearing children. How would I tell as a pregnant woman that I can easily get into this depression?
If you've had an episode of depression before your pregnancy, there are very high chances that you may get depressed either during pregnancy or soon after. Usually it is soon after. And also women who have a family history. Remember we said it is genetic?
Yes.
Yeah, it may be running in families. So if you've had a close relative who has suffered depression, you may have a chance.
Okay.
But also, if you have very difficult life circumstances, like especially if you don't have support from your spouse or father of your child,
father of the pregnancy.
yeah, the risk may also. So if you don't have support, generally support, especially from the spouse, but also from other people, you may be predisposed. Those are the commonest predisposing factors. But very young girls, girls who deliver very early in their teenage are at very high risk of developing depression in pregnancy and after. This is why we say we should avoid teenage pregnancy, because it exposes them to many things, but also to mental ill health. So those are the biggest risk factors. There are others, but the commonest are those ones.
Thank you very much. So you've learned that if you have a family member who has had depression, or we are genetically predisposed to depression, If you're stressed, and like Juliet has told us, with pregnancy comes depression, and some women are at more risk than others. For those that have psychological trauma, that have been raped, people who also have illnesses that last a long time, are susceptible to depression. Remember to send us your questions, any question you have or clarification that you need on depression, on our social media platforms, on Facebook and on Twitter.
You are watching the DocTalk Show.